Hi, everybody. I'm John Atack, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Ethan Russo. Is that the right pronunciation?
Russo, that's fine.
Russo. Okay, Ethan Russo, um, who is a medical doctor and an expert on cannabis, and a subject that I've had a great interest in for a long time, largely because of the not understanding the prohibition of it, all these years. So anyway, I was just saying a medical doctor, a general practitioner I was talking with a few months ago, insisted, I mean, he absolutely insisted that a single dose of cannabis can cause brain damage. And I said to him, I've never read anything about cannabis causing brain damage, but he was, no, this is true. He was a doctor and he was right. And that was all. So can we start there?
Well, that's nonsense.
Yeah.
Uh, no, there have been legitimate concerns about effects of cannabis on the brain,
Mm,
particularly in young people. However, there is no case for permanent damage at
mm,
all, irrespective of the degree of use. What is true to say is that number one, I don't think it is fine for teenagers to be doing bong hits in the
mm,
afternoon instead of studying or playing sports. Um, and certainly, there's no substantiation for the amotivational syndrome
mm,
or the uh, other theories that this is a gateway. This is nonsense. What has been shown is even in cases of the heaviest use, there is no evidence of any cognitive lingering effects after 30 days of abstinence. So, yes, can people overdo it? Can they be engaging in this activity rather than more helpful pursuits?
mm,
Yes, certainly. But damage to the brain, another example is there have been numerous studies in the past that alleged on imaging studies, whether it was CAT scans in the past
mm,
or MRI scans, have shown brain shrinkage. These have been unsubstantiated with subsequent better methodology.
mm,
We recently had a situation in the States. There was a big expose, let's call it, in the New York Times about the harms of cannabis. I was quoted in that article. I had spent about 5 hours with the lead reporter, and nothing of the therapeutic uses was reported at that time. Now, she has reassured me that there'll be other articles, but I wish they hadn't led with the reefer madness.
mm,
This isn't helpful in any respect.
mm.
And your friend, the physician that told you about brain damage, is doing a disservice to all his patients by promulgating such propaganda because it is just without a foundation.
Mm. Yeah, it's something that fascinates me whenever people take such a convinced position, but especially when they are people who, do have an authority. This man, he has a doctorate in medicine. He's a practicing doctor. He's a good doctor as well, in my experience. Um, but when somebody catches hold of an idea and they become certain of it, and they're now going to use it, and as you say with the media, I mean, last year I read Carl Hart's Drug Use for Grown-Ups, which is a great book. I mean, what a brave man! And to see his story that, he spent 10 years trying to show how dangerous drugs are, and was unable to substantiate these many bizarre claims that are made. And the other side of this is that, as you say, that cannabis has been used in therapy for hundreds, probably thousands of years. There's some evidence the Egyptians and we know the Chinese were using it. And there is so much positive to say about it that is ploughed under. I sometimes think it's like if people drink alcohol, that they tend to think that if you use another drug, you're bound to use it to excess. Because, and there'll be people who drink alcohol moderately, but they know that if you use another drug, you're bound to use it to excess. So there's a kind of presumption in there, which in
Right.
my experience of cannabis users is not at all true. As you say, it was the New Zealand study, wasn't it, that suggested that adolescents were, you know, they were going to be chronically demotivated as a consequence of hitting the bong in the afternoon. And there was a later study of twins showing no, this is not true. That cognitively the identical twin who did use cannabis and the one who didn't pretty much had the same scores on cognitive tests. So, but there is, a hysteria around it, isn't there? This determination to prove that this is evil. Here's a thought experiment. In the 1930s, there were cannabis cafes in the United States. A lot of the jazz musicians, Louis Armstrong, many others, Sidney Bechet, they talked about cannabis. They used cannabis. It was perfectly legal at a time, in fact, until 1933, when alcohol wasn't. My thought experiment is, what if the Volstead Act had continued? What if alcohol had continued to be illegal, which I think was a bad thing because there were far more deaths from alcohol during that period, and that cannabis had remained in use? How different might our society be with this drug that doesn't tend towards aggression in the same way that alcohol does? Um, yes.
Yeah, an intriguing thought. What one thing I can say for sure is we'd have 75 years more research on cannabis and its therapeutic uses.
Mm.
Um, as to the rest, sociologically, we can only conjecture, but I'm sure of what I've just stated.
Yeah, and it, we are now starting to see some research, and some of that research is quite remarkable. The discovery of anandamide in the brain, the analog of the delta 9 THC, saying, "Oh, we actually make this stuff, so we're all criminals." Then the discovery of there are two endocannabinoid systems that are proven. I believe there's research suggesting there might be a third system that regulate a tremendous amount of functions in the body. And so it will be true that some people have a deficiency in these systems. And so a little bit of topping up of cannabidiol, possibly of delta 9 or a THCV, would be helpful to people who are having that deficit. As you say, overuse, and it is an exceptional drug in that it can't kill you. It won't affect respiration, so you won't die, unlike with alcohol or with heroin or
From an
cocaine.
overdose. To
Yeah.
be fair, again, I like to be accurate in what we
Mm,
report. There
please.
have been deaths that we can attribute indirectly to cannabis.
Mm,
One frivolous sounding one is a fellow who the cops were at the door and tried to swallow a baggie of cannabis and choked. But more directly, there have been at least several deaths now attributed to cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome,
mm,
where people have developed an idiosyncratic reaction to cannabis and vomit
yeah.
and repeatedly abdominal pain and nausea, hot water bathing behavior, but they can deplete their electrolytes so severely as to succumb to it. That has
Okay.
occurred. But that's a real rarity. And there have been many cases in the past where, failing to find another explanation, coroners have attributed the death to cannabis, but
Mm,
falsely.
mm.
What they're finding is some old metabolites of cannabis that hang around for a while but are not psychoactive themselves. And if they couldn't find anything else, it's sort of what would you call it? Death
Elimin
by association.
yeah,
Uh,
elimination of other possibilities.
right.
Yep.
But
Yeah. I read of
um,
two cases in Germany where that was being asserted, but yeah.
right. And I've been involved in many of these debates with coroners. There have been inquiries about these, sometimes, by governments in each case, I can state that there was nothing to really point to a specific toxicity of cannabis that
Mm,
would contributed to the deaths. So there just aren't the mechanisms, aside from the one I mentioned about the secondary depletion of sodium, so that it's
mm,
so low that the body can't function any longer and the person will die. Things of that sort. But
mm.
again, distinct rarities, and again, associated with excessive use, and I mean really excessive use. Um, we have to make a distinction between the person who will come home from work, wants to forget about how what a jerk the boss was and lights up a spliff
mm,
to calm down. That's one thing. Um, as opposed to someone who is doing this all day with high
yeah,
potency material, particularly with dabs or vape pens that can be upwards of 90% THC.
mm,
That is not salutary.
mm,
We would qualify that as abuse, and it will have repercussions health-wise.
mm.
So again, everything in context.
Yeah, I mean, there's the expression, the poison is the dose. And I, I, about 10 years ago, I saw an interview with a Yardie, a Jamaican gangster who had suffered from cannabis psychosis. And I was very interested in this idea. It was, how much cannabis did he have to take for this to happen? And he was smoking an ounce of cannabis a day for 2 weeks. And you're sort of going, well, that's somewhere over 100 times, maybe more than that, of a daily dose. If you think about it in terms of alcohol, it's like drinking 200 glasses of wine a day for 2 weeks. So, you know, you have
Well,
to
that
work,
will
you have to really work at it, you know? Mm. Okay, let's talk about the benefits. What are the potential benefits of cannabis properly used at the right dose?
Sure. Well, some of these are very well established. I think it's general knowledge that cannabis can do a remarkable job of allaying nausea and vomiting associated
Mm.
with chemotherapy.
Yeah.
So that's the most obvious. Then in the UK, full disclosure, I worked full time for 11 years for GW Pharmaceuticals
Okay.
that developed Sativex, which
Mm.
is approved for treatment of spasticity and multiple sclerosis in
Yep.
30 countries, and Epidiolex, which is cannabis-derived cannabidiol that's approved for the use in treating several rare but very serious forms of epilepsy,
Mm.
Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, Dravet syndrome, and tuberous sclerosis-associated seizures. And that also is approved in the US and many other countries.
Mm.
So those are the most obvious ones. But beyond that, because of something you mentioned, the fact that THC resembles natural endogenous chemicals within called endocannabinoids, this has a role in shaping and modifying the effect of basically every physiological function in the human
Yeah.
body.
Yeah.
So when things are awry, if the activity is too great, it brings it down into the normal range. If the activity is too low, it brings it up into the normal
Mm.
range. So this is like a buffering effect. And it indicates why, while cannabis rarely cures something on a permanent basis,
Mm.
it is an effective treatment for many different conditions in many organ systems.
Mm.
Um, so there's a great versatility there. Part of the problem is people will think, gee, you say it's good for everything. Well, I don't say that.
Mm.
I will say that it has application in many disorders that are otherwise recalcitrant to treatment with conventional medicine, um, because it often is getting more to the heart of the matter. Additionally, a lot of modern medicine, synthetic chemistry, is aimed at one little specific mechanism with the hope that it's going to alter this complex
Mm.
disease, and rarely does it. With cancer these days, you don't get one drug. You usually begin with a cocktail
Mm.
of various ones because you need multiple prongs of attack for something as complex as cancer. Plus, you'll need drugs for the nausea and everything else. You'll need drugs for your gastrointestinal repercussions from the
Mm.
treatment. More often, we see cannabis, because of its versatility, replacing a whole bunch of other drugs. Um, so this is what we see in practice when people adopt cannabis, usually because they haven't gotten relief from other types of treatment.
Yeah, and I mean, it was explained to me some years ago that there are functional and structural drugs, and that a drug like alcohol will actually affect the structure of the brain. It will kill brain cells, in simple terms. And it was in a documentary in 1991 called Hooked. And it changed my attitude about heroin because, you know, in my milieu, among my friends, heroin was regarded as negatively as it is by the general public. And I've still never felt tempted to take it. But nonetheless, this guy actually held up brain slices. He was a pathologist. And he said, this is a brain slice from a heroin user. This is a functional drug. It's natural to the body. There is nothing wrong with this brain. And then he held up a brain slice from an alcoholic and he said, do you see these holes in the brain? This is a wet brain. This is somebody who suffered from alcoholism. And that it was a very striking demonstration of that I had accepted, the social view of heroin, and hadn't really understood what was happening physiologically. With cannabis, again, you have a drug that is functional. And as with heroin, diamorphine, it is taken up by the body because there are receptors within the body for it. And so we come to this strange anomaly. I mean, in drug testing in this country, of course, cannabis is still completely illegal. You can actually receive 14 years in prison for a first offence. Nobody does. And they kind of say, well, you see, well, nobody does, so that's okay. And I'm kind of going, not really good having the law
Well,
there, is it? If
the
it's not,
law.
you're not going to be useful. But it's led to a tremendous division where we have something like 40 distinct police districts in the United Kingdom. And it depends who is the chief constable in each area as to how cannabis is dealt with. In some places, for quite some time, the view has been, well, you just walk away, don't do anything. But it's still possible for prosecutions to take place. And you're sort of going, this does seem a terrible waste of time. You know,
Yes, I know the British people very well, and this is not the kind of inconsistency with which they would be comfortable. So it really needs attention to be changed
mm,
and be equitable. One rule for everyone.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, I followed, what the Portuguese did in 2000, where they said that the use of drugs is no longer a criminal offence. And that's that. And their crime rates dropped, their drug usage rates dropped, as it happened in Holland before in the 70s, until they got a flood of drug users into Holland because it was a safer country for them to be in. But in terms of even the use of cannabis, the age that was expected, which I think was about 19 here, that it averaged out that cannabis users would be adolescent. It moved upward in Holland because it was no longer considered exciting for adolescents to do it because it wasn't criminal.
well, the same things happen in the States.
Mm.
In fact, with legalization, whether medically or for so-called recreational use of cannabis, use rates among youth have actually dropped because it has lost its cachet.
Yeah.
If your dad is using cannabis to treat his prostate cancer, it's just not, it's no longer a form of rebellion for you to be doing it. But again, it sounds glib, but in fact, that is the epidemiological trend that we've seen, decreased youth rates where there has been legalization.
Mm. I mean, in Colorado, in the second year after legalization, I read that statistically there was an 11% decline in the sale of alcohol,
That
alongside, yeah, alongside a decline in violent crime. So we find ourselves in a sociologically a very interesting situation here in terms of what we do and don't do. And when I first wrote to you, I talked about a book called The Black Candle, which I had to go and find again. And this was written by yeah, by a Canadian juvenile magistrate under the name Janie Cannock. And as far as I understand it, it's a primary reason that cannabis became illegal in Canada, I think in
right.
1924. with no further research because she says that what will happen is that white women will have sex with black men. This apparently is something that happens if you use cannabis, and will have dual race children, dual, it's kind of, and therefore we should make it illegal. And as we look back at the criminalization of drugs, say from 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the US, which is a bizarre and despicable thing, that there were too many Chinese people in the United States, so they were banned. And the next thing was to ban opium in the smoked form because the Chinese used opium. The
Right.
more concentrated forms, laudanum, codeine, morphine, and diamorphine, were still permitted until the Harrison Act came along and scooped them up.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So, no, it's true that global prohibition was fueled by racism,
Hmm.
and no less in the United States, because Anslinger was the analog in the States to Janie Canuck in Canada.
Hmm.
And clearly, his writings and speeches were overtly racist, espousing the same kinds of nonsense, uh, right?
Yeah. And with Anslinger, I mean, at the beginning of his career, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, he wants to rival the FBI. He wants to build something as big as Hoover's organization. And one of his early statements in the 30s is that there are no dangers with cannabis or marijuana, as he mistakenly called it. I believe the term means anything you can smoke. Um, it doesn't, marijuana is not marijuana is not cannabis in its origins etymologically, but whichever. So that when he held his hearings in 1937, somebody came along from the AMA and said, I'm sorry I'm late, but I didn't realize that this stuff you're calling marijuana is what we call cannabis, which we think is a vital medicine. And
It
that
was
was the
still on
American,
the formulary
yeah,
in the United States, sold by mainstream pharmaceutical companies.
yeah. Eli Lilly, for example, the
Right.
people who sell Prozac
Park
were,
Davis and others.
hmm,
Yes.
and Merck and others, of course, were selling cocaine and these drugs of abuse. We're now seeing the plague of fentanyl and carfentanil, but it follows a pattern that goes right back to probably the end of the American Civil War, where you have these it's incredibly traumatized population, both physically and psychologically, and they're being sold snake oil. But some of that snake oil works. It's generally, from my observation, a mixture of alcohol, opium, and cannabis. And it makes people, feel a little better as a consequence. But the big pharmaceutical companies, they start there. And so they are, in modern terms, the drug pushers of that time. Now we're seeing a different perception of those drugs and different use. So, I mean, I was very surprised when my daughter was in hospital giving birth that she was given heroin. It's like, oh, she was given diamorphine. We call it
Right.
this other name. So it's now, and that division, that idea of even the use of the word drug, drugs, as if you can classify all of this wide range of substances and say, well, they are drugs, meaning street drugs, meaning bad. There was a Professor David Nutt at Imperial, who was the head of the government's misuse of drugs committee in this country. The Home Secretary Jackie Smith went to him and said, "You can't compare cannabis with these other, with alcohol." And he said, "Why not?" He said, "Because it's illegal."
Yeah, but it's a very circular reasoning. He
Isn't it?
also had the audacity to tell the truth that it was more dangerous to ride a horse than it was to use cannabis, and got
Equicy.
sacked because of that. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, that in yes, in terms of mortality, you're much more likely to come to harm riding a horse than you were using MDMA, ecstasy, and,
right.
and and he invented the term equicy for the yeah
But yeah, I mean, but yeah, he alienated a large group of equestrians who likely have a great deal of political and financial influence.
yeah bad idea here, and there are probably fox hunters as well. Who knows? Um, you wanted to talk about limonene. Um,
Sure.
and there was another substance, canna with a G in
Cannabigerol, CBG. So, yeah,
CBG.
basically, this is following up on the kind of work I've done over the last 28 years in cannabis research and development. Cannabis is an herb.
Mm,
It is an herb that makes over 500 different chemicals, which include 150 different phytocannabinoids, plant cannabinoids. So it's not all just about the more familiar THC, tetrahydrocannabinol,
mm,
and CBD, cannabidiol. Rather, so there are 148 other cannabinoids, and so far we know something about the pharmacology of about 15.
mm,
But in each instance, they have some very amazing therapeutic properties, and very, very few of them are intoxicating.
yeah.
So this is quite illuminating. Beyond that, there are 200 different terpenoids in cannabis.
Mm,
These are the essential oil elements that provide the characteristic aroma,
mm,
but they also contribute to the therapeutic effects and often allay the side effects of THC. So this year we've published two studies. One was done with Spindle et al., Ryan Vondre's group out of Johns Hopkins University, in which we showed that limonene, which is the scent of citrus, also found in cannabis, will substantially reduce THC associated anxiety. And this is
okay.
done in a randomized controlled fashion, double blind, you know, everything done to show that it was the drugs and their interaction rather than some other influence.
Mm,
Um, but this was in support of what's called the entourage effect, the
yeah.
idea that you have certain soloists, we'll call them, like THC in cannabis, that are very much influenced and harmonized with these other chemicals. The second study was on cannabigerol, which is sort of the mother of all cannabinoids. So THC and CBD are produced from it in the plant. Usually it doesn't stop at CBG, but goes on to those. But with selective breeding, CBG only plants have been developed. CBG is a remarkable agent in that we were able to show in this other study, um, Cutler et al., my colleagues at Washington State University, that CBG has a pronounced anti-anxiety effect at a relatively low dose with no evidence of impairment um, at all. And we know that there's no withdrawal from it because clinicians, particularly in the Northwest part of the United States, have a lot of access to this and have been using it extensively in their patients. So those both of those papers are available free to your listeners at ethanrusso.org at the library tab, and they should be near the top. Um, first one was Spindle et al. About limonene and THC, and second Cutler, two T's et al. I was a co-author on each of these studies. So the second one is about cannabigerol and its effects.
Fascinating. We'll put the links in the description. Um, Going forward, um, there is this conversation. You worked with GW, developing Sativex. Going forward, there is this idea that for the pharmaceutical companies, there's not the same amount of interest because this is an existing chemical. It's not something that can be patented. And
Well, yeah, there's wiggle room around
mm,
that. You can't patent a plant. You can patent a kind of plant if you've bred for a quality that wasn't there before. Additionally, there can be use patents describing how a plant or extract can be used to treat a specific disorder, or an extraction technique so that you've produced a product from the plant that again wouldn't be there in its raw form. But yeah, this is one reason this has been less attractive to the big drug companies, where the preferred methodology is one in which they computer design a molecule that will work on a specific receptor with
Mm.
high potency and affinity, and they worry about the toxicology later. What are the side effects? Um, but again, this is so focused that it often really doesn't have a big influence on the disease process. Um, with cannabis, we're really treating things more holistically. I know that's sort of a buzzword that sets off
You
alarms for
don't mean
folks.
the new age, you mean what the word means, yeah.
Right. But no, I mean, that's really what people want. With cannabis, often we can offer people better treatment with fewer side effects and the possibility of reducing the number of drugs they're already taking. So that should be attractive to people. And that's what we find in practice when knowledgeable physicians work with patients to find the best cannabis-based treatment for their condition.
And I mean, the idea with CBG that it will diminish anxiety, that's an incredibly important thing because we're still stuck with the benzodiazepines, Valium, diazepam, and they came along as miracle drugs that were going to replace barbiturates, which had been shown to be enormously dangerous, and we then had to start dealing with addiction to benzodiazepines, and
Exactly.
and in this country, physicians have become very wary about their use because of a longitudinal study that suggested that people who use um, benzodiazepines will have a shorter life.
No,
Um,
it's true. And it's particularly the case when they're used in dementia, so people with Alzheimer's disease. The morbidity, meaning medical side effects and mortality, actually rapidly increase with use of the benzodiazepines to try and treat their agitation, or with the antipsychotic drugs. Both lead to quicker demise,
mm,
whereas we have very strong evidence that cannabis-based treatments really help substantially in reducing symptoms, agitation, better sleep, um, less nursing care requirement, and both THC and CBD have shown influences to reduce the actual pathology
mm.
inherent in Alzheimer's disease. This is not to say cure, but it may be that they slow degenerative process in the disorder.
Absolutely. And how much is this actually getting into society? How much are these treatments being used so
Well,
far?
much of it is clandestine. You
Mm,
know, if someone has a family member that's willing to treat their parent or grandparent with this, I like to give the example. There's a town in Northern California. My colleague Jeff Hergenrather works at one of the nursing homes there. So in one nursing home, they allow cannabis usage by their clientele, and the other they don't. And they're getting remarkable benefits.
mm.
Again, less nursing care, fewer accidents, people actually showing improvement in their memory and functioning, certainly in mood. So what's happening now is a lot of the families of the folks in the nursing home where they don't use cannabis are trying to get their relative transferred to the other one. Um, but yeah, this is going on. A lot of it, again, is beneath the proverbial radar.
Mm.
But currently, we're in development with a company called Canurda in Canada to treat another degenerative disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, what you in the UK call motor neuron disease. We expect that the same formulation should work very well in Alzheimer's disease treatment, but that needs to come later because ALS is what's called an orphan disorder. the development pathway to gain approval is a little bit shorter and easier.
Mm.
Um, so we'd want to prove it in motor neuron disease first and then try to tackle Alzheimer's disease and other dementias.
Fascinating. I mean, Stephen Hawking, of course, had motor neuron disease and lived about 60 years longer than he was meant to
Right,
live.
but
But
that is so far from the norm.
yeah,
It's a
absolutely. The
wonderful
expectations.
story.
Yeah.
He actually may have had a variation.
Mm,
I wonder, I haven't examined his records, of course,
yeah.
but he may have had a related disorder called Kugelberg-Welander syndrome,
Okay.
which very similar effects, but a very much slower deterioration. In any event, it's the same kind of thing. And had we been 20 years earlier, I certainly would have been interested in trying to offer him treatment.
Yeah. A remarkable man. Um, there are so many uses that are attributed to cannabis, and of course, we're sort of halfway between, folk medicine and, real, scientifically demonstrated medical treatment. One of the stories that continues to come back is that Richard Milhouse Nixon commissioned a study, I think, at the University of West Virginia, with the instruction that they should demonstrate that cannabis destroyed the immune system. And this, let's just presume the result. He also privately, it has come out, said that he knew that cannabis was not in the least bit dangerous. But he was a strange man. Um, but that study was actually kept secret for a very long time because they, in fact, tried cannabis on mice with three different kinds of cancer, if I've remembered properly. And they found that in the control group, all of the mice died, whereas the mice that got stoned survived longer.
Right,
And this was held back. So, how about this? The idea that the cannabis may help somebody to deal with cancer better,
right,
accepting that cancer is not a single disorder, it's a process that occurs.
sure. So there are two aspects to this. First is what we'll call palliative. Can we treat the symptoms?
Mm,
So, as we mentioned, cannabis can do a remarkable job in allaying nausea and vomiting
mm,
associated with chemotherapy and spurring appetite.
yeah.
But beyond that, it helps with sleep, it helps with pain. So all the associated symptoms inherent with many forms of cancer can often be addressed with cannabis-based
Mm,
treatments. So that's one category. That's secondary symptom treatment.
yeah.
How about primary treatment of cancer? Well, the cannabinoids have a remarkable property in that they are cytotoxic. They are poison to cancer cells while being preservative of normal cells.
Mm,
So this is exactly the opposite of standard chemotherapy, where they're generally toxic, and you hope that you kill the tumor before you kill the patient. And again, cannabigerol that I mentioned earlier is remarkable in treating certain kinds of cell types in cancer, particularly prostate cancer and certain types of breast cancer, because it targets something called TRPM8, the menthol receptor. It's sort of a cold receptor. Um, this is overexpressed in prostate cancer, which is one of the most common cancers of men,
mm,
um, and very specific for that. And because cannabigerol is not intoxicating, and really has so few side effects, very high doses of this could be utilized to primarily treat prostate cancer. And again, this is something that we're seeking to develop. I'm sorry to say that funding is always a major issue, and things are moving extremely slowly when this should be the so-called full court press.
Yeah. And how about other conditions? Um, yeah, because as you say, it has a palliative aspect, so it's going to be useful for many people in many situations. I have a friend who has fibromyalgia, and because I had uh, read about the potential beneficial effects, and because fibromyalgia, although it is a kind of medical umbrella term for pain in more than a certain amount of parts of the body, but she's suffered terribly, and I spent, I think it was about 8 years talking with her and saying, well, it could be that cannabidiol would help you. It could be that THC would help you. And it was quite remarkable. She eventually, took the plunge and had complete remission of pain briefly. It wasn't permanent, but she's found that as a part of treatment, and she has had so many treatments over the years, that this was something that was effective. And so I think there's a Canadian study, a large enough study on pain, which seems to say, yes, we have something here that is effective against pain for many people. And you're not going to have the same problems that you're going to have with opium or opioids. And indeed, I read that cannabis actually can help to make opioid medicines more effective.
That's
So,
true.
so we,
Yeah, so fibromyalgia is one of what I have termed clinical endocannabinoid deficiency disorders. So, in common with migraine and irritable bowel syndrome, in that these are disorders where there is pain without obvious tissue abnormality. Conventional drugs work very poorly. There was a survey study in over 1,300 patients undertaken in the States some years ago. They compared people's feelings about efficacy of cannabis compared to the three Food and Drug Administration approved drugs for fibromyalgia. People found that the three approved drugs worked extremely poorly,
mm,
and cannabis worked extremely well in contrast. So, what's wrong with this picture?
yeah, what a place we have arrived at, with our arrogance about our scientific understanding of the world and our stupidity politically and
Something I
socially.
John, I want to interject here, and that is that people should not confuse psychoactivity with efficacy in terms
Mm,
of treating symptoms. The fact of the matter is, and particularly with fibromyalgia, the doses of cannabis or THC required to get benefit are very low.
mm,
Um, and most often, and certainly this is true in the Sativex program, without any intoxication. In other words, you should be able to treat these various symptoms without being high.
mm.
Not that that's necessarily a bad thing. Euphoria is considered a side effect by the FDA and most regulators, however. So,
It's
God
an,
forbid that you feel better from
you
your
know,
medicine.
we of course have a law in this country brought in by Theresa May when she was Home Secretary called the Legal Highs Act, which basically prohibits any chemical that makes you feel happy.
Well,
Um,
alcohol, well,
well,
a lot of people missing their pint of bitters after work. So.
I've thought about initiating a campaign to make chocolate illegal because obviously this law does cover chocolate, and we are told that there are possibly certain analogs of
Well, you've
cannabinoids in
really
chocolate.
highlighted the issue here, which is the people that make the rules, i.e., politicians, are the most ignorant of the issues. This is an area where scientists and physicians at least need to have input,
Hmm.
if not be the ones making up the rules in regards to treatment.
Yeah, I mean, we got stuck in this country when David Nutt was trying to revise the law, and we did. Cannabis was briefly moved down in classification from a B to a C, which is the level of prescription drugs. Um, but there was one person on the committee who objected and said that she thought that cannabis might cause bowel cancer. And as far as I understand, this was the only objection that remained. And politicians grabbed hold of this and said, well, therefore. And, having tabloid journalism surrounding this.
Sure.
Um,
Unfortunate that she was just wrong. So,
yeah. And here we still are. The 1971 law still applies. In fact, I think 2018, finally a group of MPs got together and said it was a situation. A friend of mine was busted for growing cannabis. Now, he'd been prescribed cannabis but couldn't get it. His doctor wouldn't permit it, and he had it for pain. So he grew his own. He was raided and ended up in court over this, with this bizarre situation that the court said, well, actually, legally, it's been determined by the court that cannabis has no medical use. And in, I think it was 2018, Parliament finally ruled that cannabis does have medical use. It doesn't mean we're still fighting for the 2,000 or so epileptics for whom this is the only viable treatment. We're still fighting for them to get this for reasons that are beyond human understanding, as far as I'm concerned. How on earth we've come to this situation where somebody can say, it is now, since I think the 1950s in this country, legal to commit suicide. You can commit suicide if you want to. You can maim yourself. You can poison yourself with, deadly nightshade from your garden. You can do all of these sort of things, but you must not take these drugs. And there's kind of a gap in reasoning there. The other question I have is about schizophrenia, that it's been put forward that it's possible that the use of cannabis by an adolescent who has a schizophrenic tendency, the one in however many hundred people that is, fairly small number, but nonetheless, that it might bring on the symptoms of schizophrenia earlier.
That's true. But again, you've said this exactly correctly. This does Cannabis does not cause psychosis de novo. If someone has this underlying tendency, it will be unmasked sooner uh, through excessive use of cannabis. So yes, honestly, there's some people that shouldn't use cannabis, but um, interestingly, high doses of cannabidiol treat psychosis equally or better than conventional antipsychotics. So there are two sides to that story as well. But again, there were two studies out of the UK that basically showed if you were going to eliminate cannabis use, as if you could, how many people would need to stop or never use cannabis to avoid one case of schizophrenia? And it was about 5,000 people for
Mm.
men and 8,000 for women. So patently ridiculous. Um, again, we still hear this. This has been batted around since 1894 when it was debunked in the Indian
The India
Hemp
Hemp
Drugs
Drugs
Commission
Committee.
report.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that one, that's a lot of myths persist.
Mm.
But, we're living in an age where conspiracy theories reign and truth gets short shrift.
Absolutely. And I mean, a lot of what I do is my concern is authoritarianism in society, as expressed through pseudo-religious, political, commercial cults. And foundational to that is the question: how do you tell whether you're being told the truth? you know, so I've just this afternoon talked with a good friend of mine who's a survivor of a group, very intelligent man with a degree from Princeton, but he's a survivor of 20 years in an astrology based group. And it is sort of, for me, I sort of look at that and go, so the position of rocks in the heavens is determining what happens to me. That's not really making sense. But I have in my life known two astrologers who were, they were not deep relationships, I have to say, but they were people I knew who were so completely convinced of this. And so changing something in our society, particularly in our schools, to move them away from the kind of obedience centered teaching towards curiosity. My friend Ira Chalef wrote a wonderful book called Intelligent Disobedience. This idea that if you're training a guide dog for somebody blind, the dog has to be able to disobey. It has to say, you're going to walk into something, stop. And why don't we train our kids to be intelligently disobedient? And maybe if we did, there would, and we are living in a time of anti-science. We're living in a time where people have, mistakenly decided that reason is a bad idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we could talk about this forever. I mean,
Mm.
there was a party in the US in the 1850s called the Know Nothings, who are proud of their ignorance. And it's very much the same situation today. So if I go on, I'll betray my leanings here. But no,
So I've done programs about Donald Trump. You can betray your leanings.
it's a difficult time to be an expert in something because your knowledge can easily be refuted by a know-nothing with a
Mm.
strong opinion and a loud voice.
We had a situation in the UK when a man called Michael Gove was the education minister. And one day he declared, we've all had enough of experts. Now, all of his experts, he's the education minister, had told him that the system of examination in schools is a bad idea. So if you look at the PISA tables that are taken every 2 years of schools in more than 100 countries, every 2 years, Finland comes out as the most literate country in the world. They have one exam at the end of your 13 years in school. They don't have this, SATs all the time and all this stuff. Michael Gove, having decided he'd had enough of experts, took away all other methods of measure. Everything is now again based on exams because, well, he thinks it's a good idea. But there is a little corollary to this story, which is that his leading expert was a man called Dominic Cummings, who would be the architect of Brexit, which was a massive piece of manipulation of public thinking with a barrage of lies. But that's who his expert was. So he was maybe right in that one case. But to say we don't want people who know about the subject, as you say, know nothings, flat brain society people, this is a bad way to go, and we are seeing populism and authoritarianism on the increase in our world. Um, but as you say, this is a subject probably for another day, um, and we can spend hours talking about it. This has been such a pleasure. Um, Thank you so much, and hopefully people will give us some comments, some things to think about, and I'll get back to you and I hope we're able to talk again because I say it's
Oh,
been a
it's a delight. Thank you for the opportunity.
great. Thank you so much, Ethan. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.